The beer bottle hit the German Shepherd across the spine. The dog stumbled sideways on the brick walkway, but did not cry. He had learned, in compounds and corridors far from this place, what it meant to absorb impact without vocalizing, and even now, in the fading autumn light of a public park in Cedar Falls, Colorado, that training held. The bottle shattered on the bricks, and the boy who had thrown it, blonde, 21, wearing a jacket that cost more than some people's rent, laughed the way a person laughs when consequences have never arrived, and when the concept of arrival has become, over the course of a lifetime of insulation, genuinely unimaginable. Two of his friends stood behind him, phones raised, filming. A woman on a bench 30 feet away gripped the edge of the wooden seat and did not move. Nobody in the park moved. The dog stood, shook the glass from his coat, and turned his head, not toward the boy, but toward the man sitting on the bench across the path, whose hands had gone very still on his knees, and whose eyes had changed in a way that no one in that park understood yet, but that the dog recognized instantly. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What you're about to hear is the reason this town will never be the same. We read every single comment, and we want to know where this story reaches. Captain Ethan Drake, United States Navy, retired, had been sitting on that bench for 20 minutes before the bottle was thrown. He had been watching the last of the afternoon light cross the mountains to the west and thinking about nothing in particular, which was a skill he had only recently begun to develop, and which required more effort than anything he had done in 22 years of service. He was 43 years old, 6'2", and built with the kind of lean, deliberate density that comes not from lifting weights in a gym, but from decades of carrying loads across terrain that punished excess and rewarded economy, broad through the shoulders, narrow through the waist, with forearms that showed tendon and vein in the way of a man whose body had been a tool for so long that it had forgotten how to be anything else. His hair was dark, cut short, threaded with silver at the temples and above the ears in a way that aged him precisely as much as he had earned. His face was angular and hard-planed, with a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who intended it to be used, and a nose that had been broken in Ramadi in 2006, and again in a training accident at Dam Neck that he had never fully explained to anyone. His eyes were dark blue, not bright, not vivid, but deep and still in the way that deep water is still, the surface revealing nothing of what moves beneath. They were the eyes of a man who had spent 2 decades watching things that most people would spend a lifetime trying to forget, and who had reached an arrangement with the watching that did not include looking away. He had completed 5 deployments with Naval Special Warfare: Ramadi, the Korangal, Helmand Province, a joint operation in northern Syria, and a final deployment to a location in the Western Pacific that existed only as a set of coordinates in a classified file and a scar on the inside of his left forearm where a knife had found him in a room he could not discuss. He had commanded a SEAL platoon and then a troop, and he had been promoted to captain before the accumulated cost of the work had presented itself in a form that could no longer be deferred. A traumatic brain injury from a breaching charge in Helmand that had taken his sense of smell and left him with a tremor in his right hand that appeared when he was tired or angry, and that he had learned, through discipline and repetition, to make invisible to everyone except the dog. He had retired 9 months ago. He had moved to Cedar Falls because a friend from the teams had told him it was quiet, and quiet was the only prescription that had ever made any difference. He was not bitter. He was simply a man standing at the end of something, trying to decide whether what came next was a beginning or just a different kind of distance. Sarge was lying at his feet when the bottle hit. Sarge was a 9-year-old German Shepherd, 81 pounds, with a coat that had once been rich black and gold, but had begun to lighten across the muzzle and chest into the dignified silver amber of an aging working dog who had earned every gray hair through service rather than time. His right ear was clipped short, not neatly, not surgically, but torn, where an eyed blast in the Korengal in 2019 had sent a piece of vehicle panel through the air and taken the top 2 inches of cartilage with it. The wound had healed into a ragged edge that made his profile distinctive and slightly fierce, and he carried it the way old soldiers carry their scars, without apology and without explanation. His left rear leg bore a pin from a fracture sustained during a fast rope insertion in Syria, and he moved with a gait that was not quite a limp, but not quite smooth. A measured, careful stride that spoke of a body that had been asked to do more than bodies are designed to do, and had complied for longer than anyone had a right to expect. His eyes were amber brown, warm and watchful, and they tracked the world with the quiet diligence of a dog who had never been told that his war was over, and who would not have believed it if someone had tried. Ethan had spent 10 months and 2 appeals to the Secretary of the Navy's office to get Sarge released from the military working dog program. The paperwork had been a campaign in itself. He did not discuss it. He simply said that Sarge had saved his life 3 times, and that 3 was a debt that paperwork could not cancel. They had not spent a day apart since. Cedar Falls, Colorado, sat in a valley on the western slope of the Rockies at an elevation where autumn arrived early and stayed long, and the particular afternoon in question was the kind that the town had been built to hold, late October, the aspens on the surrounding hillsides burning gold and orange against a sky so blue it looked engineered. The air carrying the clean bite of altitude and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from chimneys that had started up for the season. The park at the center of town was a rectangle of grass and brick walkways lined with benches and old cottonwoods whose leaves had already turned and were falling in slow spirals that caught the light as they came down. It was the kind of place where people walked dogs and drank coffee and believed, without examining the belief too carefully, that they lived somewhere good. Brandon Ashworth was 21 years old and had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His father, Clayton Ashworth, owned the Ashworth Development Group, which controlled the majority of commercial real estate in Cedar Falls and the surrounding county. The shopping center on Route 6, the new medical plaza, the apartment complex on Elk Ridge Drive, and the building that housed the county clerk's office, which paid rent to Clayton's LLC on a 15-year lease that had been approved by a county commission on which Clayton's college roommates sat. The Ashworth name was on the new wing of the Cedar Falls Community Center and on the scoreboard at the high school football field, and on a bronze plaque in the lobby of the county courthouse that read "Donated by the Ashworth family in service to our community." Brandon had been arrested twice. Once for vandalism at a campground outside Glenwood Springs, and once for assaulting a bartender in Aspen who had cut him off. And both times the charges had been dismissed after calls were made by people whose names Brandon did not need to know. He had learned from this what most people learn from impunity, that the world was a place organized for his convenience, and that anyone who existed outside that organization was either an obstacle or entertainment. "Do it again," one of his friends said, reaching for another bottle from the six-pack on the grass behind them. Brandon took it. He weighed it in his hand and looked at the dog, which was standing now, facing him, with its ears flat and its body held in the coiled stillness of an animal that is deciding, with a patience that has been trained into it by people who understood the cost of premature decisions, what the correct response is. The old woman on the bench spoke first. Her name was Martha Callahan. She was 74 years old, with silver hair pulled back, and hands that had spent 40 years arranging flowers at the Cedar Falls Lutheran Church. She had watched the Ashworth boy break a window at the barber shop on Main Street 3 years ago, and seen nothing happen. She had watched him scream at a waitress at the Elkhorn Diner until the girl cried and walk out without paying, and seen nothing happen. She had stopped calling the police about Brandon Ashworth because calling the police about Brandon Ashworth was the same as calling the weather service about the wind. You could report it, but nobody was going to stop it. "Leave that dog alone," Martha said. Her voice shook, but she did not look away. Brandon turned to her. "Mind your business, Grandma." Martha's hands tightened on the bench. She did not move. She did not speak again. But something in her face, the particular expression of a woman who has watched cruelty go unanswered for years and has reached the limit of what silence can hold, was visible to anyone who was paying attention. Ethan Drake was paying attention. He stood. The motion was unhurried. It carried no aggression and no performance. It was the motion of a man rising from a bench, the way a structure rises, with weight and foundation, and the particular inevitability of something that once in motion does not reverse. Sarge did not move. Sarge stayed exactly where he was, facing Brandon, his amber eyes locked on the boy's hands with the focus of an animal who has been trained to watch hands, because hands hold the things that cause harm. "Put the bottle down," Ethan said. His voice was quiet, not soft, quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a space more completely than shouting because it asks the listener to come to it rather than retreating from it. Brandon looked at him. He saw a tall man in a plain jacket with a dog. He did not see anything else. He did not see the 22 years. He did not see the 5 deployments. He did not see the Silver Star or the 2 Bronze Stars or the Purple Heart or the men who had followed this man into rooms where the door was the last safe thing they would touch. He saw a stranger in a park telling him what to do, and strangers in parks did not tell Brandon Ashworth what to do. "Or what?" Brandon said. He smiled. His friends shifted behind him, not with concern, with anticipation. Ethan did not respond. He looked at Brandon the way he had looked at a great many things in his life that required assessment before action, without hurry, without anger, with the calibrated patience of a man who has learned that the moment before a decision is more important than the decision itself. He was measuring. Brandon did not know he was being measured. Brandon threw the second bottle, not at the dog, at Ethan. It passed 2 feet to his left and shattered on the walkway behind him. The sound was sharp and flat in the autumn air. Ethan did not flinch. He did not move. The tremor in his right hand, which no one could see, went still, which was what it always did when the situation shifted from ambiguous to clear. Sarge moved. He stepped forward, not lunging, not barking, but placing himself directly between Brandon and the bench where Martha sat, his body angled in the flat, deliberate posture of a military working dog executing a block. His hackles rose in a ridge along his spine. His eyes did not leave Brandon's hands. The message was not subtle. The message was a wall. Brandon looked at the dog. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. Not fear, not yet, but the unfamiliar sensation of encountering something that was not going to move because he wanted it to. "Control your dog," Brandon said. His voice was different now. Tighter, thinner. "He is controlled," Ethan said. "He's doing exactly what he was trained to do. The question is whether you're smart enough to understand what that means." "You know who my father is?" "I know exactly who you are," Ethan said. "I know about the campground. I know about the bartender in Aspen. I know your father made calls both times. I know that nobody in this town has held you accountable for anything you've done because your family name is on buildings and your father's money is in pockets. I've known men like you my entire career. I commanded a SEAL platoon in Ramadi and a troop in the Korengal, and I have watched men with real courage walk into places where the cost of arrogance is paid in blood. You are not dangerous. You are careless. There is a difference, and that dog standing in front of you right now is the only reason I am explaining it to you with words. Nobody in the park breathed. Brandon's friends had lowered their phones. Martha Callahan's hands had stopped shaking. Brandon took a step backward. His face was the face of a young man who has walked into every room of his life with the assumption that the room would bend, and who has just entered a room that will not. My father will. Your father isn't here, Ethan said. I am. And what is here, right now, is a retired Navy captain who spent 22 years in places your father's money couldn't buy a minute of safety. And a military working dog with 9 years of combat deployments who has decided that you are a threat to the woman on that bench. Those are the facts of this moment. What you do with them is the only decision you have left. A cruiser pulled into the parking lot at the edge of the park. Deputy Alana Ruiz stepped out. She was 36 years old and had been with the Cedar Falls Department for 8 years, and she had responded to 4 prior complaints involving Brandon Ashworth, all of which had been quietly closed after conversations between the chief and Clayton Ashworth that she had not been invited to attend. She had kept her own records. She had kept copies of every complaint, every witness statement, every photograph. She had kept them in a folder on her personal laptop that she had labeled insurance, and that she had been waiting, with the particular patience of a person who believes in systems even when systems fail, to deliver to someone who would act on them. She walked across the grass. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Sarge, who had not moved and whose posture communicated everything that needed to be communicated about the situation. She looked at Brandon. I saw it from the road, she said. I saw the bottle hit the dog. I saw the second one. She arrested Brandon Ashworth in the park, in the October light, in front of Martha Callahan and the 2 friends who were no longer filming, and a growing cluster of people who had gathered the way people gather when they sense that something that should have happened a long time ago is finally happening. She charged him with animal cruelty, assault, and disorderly conduct. His friends gave their names and left without speaking. Clayton Ashworth arrived at the station 40 minutes later with an attorney. He made calls. The calls, for the first time, did not work. Deputy Ruiz had already forwarded her 8 years of documentation, the 4 prior incidents, the closed complaints, the pattern of interference, to the district attorney's office in Glenwood Springs, and to a reporter at the Glenwood Springs Post-Independent who had been covering county corruption stories for 3 years. The reporter's article ran 4 days later. It named Clayton Ashworth. It named the county commission member. It named the lease on the county clerk's office. It named the 2 dismissed charges. Brandon Ashworth pleaded guilty to misdemeanor animal cruelty and assault. He was sentenced to 12 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a restitution payment to the Cedar Falls Animal Welfare Fund that his attorney negotiated down to $5,000, but that the judge made clear, in open court, was a courtesy the defendant had not earned. Clayton Ashworth retained his properties, but lost his seat on the Community Center Board and his position on the County Development Advisory Committee. The bronze plaque in the courthouse lobby was quietly removed in January. No one asked where it went. 6 months after the afternoon in the park, Ethan Drake sat on the same bench where it had happened, a cup of coffee in his left hand, his right hand resting on Sarge's back. The tremor was there. It was always there in the mornings. But it was quieter now, or he had grown more accustomed to it. Or the difference between the two had stopped mattering. The aspens on the hillside had leafed out again in the pale, new green of early May, and the air smelled like cottonwood and cut grass, and the particular sweetness of a mountain town waking up after a long winter. Martha Callahan walked past every Tuesday morning on her way to arrange flowers at the church, and she always stopped, and she always put her hand on Sarge's head and held it there for a moment, and Sarge always let her. She never mentioned the afternoon. She didn't need to. The bench and the dog and the man sitting on it said everything that needed to be said about what had changed and why. Sarge lay in the grass beside the bench with his clipped ear turned toward the sun, and his eyes half closed in the slow, contented blink of an old dog who has reached the portion of his life where warmth and stillness are not just acceptable, but earned. His pin-stiffened leg was stretched out behind him at the angle he preferred, and his breathing was deep and even and unhurried. He was not scanning. He was not assessing. For the first time in 9 years, the perimeter was secure and the cost of relaxing was nothing at all. Ethan watched him. He drank his coffee. The mountains were still there. The quiet was still there. And somewhere inside the narrow space between what he had been and what he was becoming, Ethan Drake had begun to believe that the bench and the dog and the coffee and the slow turning of seasons in a town that had, for reasons he could not entirely explain, decided to keep him, that this was not the distance he had feared. It was the beginning he had almost missed. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as an old dog who stands between cruelty and kindness without being asked, who places his body where his body needs to be, because loyalty is not a decision he makes, but the only language he has ever spoken. God does not always send justice in the forms we expect. Sometimes he sends it through the quiet refusal of one person to look away, and through the steady courage of an animal whose service did not end when the uniform came off. In our own lives, we pass moments like Martha's more often than we admit. Moments when something wrong is happening in front of us, and the easiest thing is to stay seated. The question is never whether we have the power to act. The question is whether we have the character to stand up. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, have you ever watched someone stand up when everyone else stayed silent? Your story might be the one that gives someone else the courage to rise. If you believe in stories of loyalty, justice, and the unbreakable bond between warriors and the dogs who walk beside them, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and grant you the strength to stand when standing is the hardest thing, because you are never, ever alone.